We are live. Okay, what do I need to do? Need to get down there. Good evening, ladies and gents, wherever you may be around the world, and welcome to Splendid Isolation History number 14. You will notice we did not have a number 13. We don't have 13s on Splendid Isolation. As always, I'm going to start us off with a bit of a tune to give people a chance to join the stream and what have you.
Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on flooded folk and wall. Your new gods, sullen peoples, have devil and have child. Take up the white man's burden, in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror, and check the show of pride. By open speech and simple, 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace. Fill full the mouth of famine, and bid the sickness cease. And when your goal is nearest, the end for others sought, what's love that heed and folly, bring all your hopes to naught. Take up the white man's burden, no tawdry rule of kings, but toil of serf and sweeper, the tale of common things. The ports ye shall not enter, the roads ye shall not tread. Go make them with your living, and mark them with your dead. Take up the white man's burden, and reap his old reward. The blame of those ye better, the hate of those ye guard. The cry of those ye humor, are slowly towards the light. Why brought ye us from bondage, a loved Egyptian night? Take up the white man's burden, ye dare not stoop to less, nor call too loud on freedom, to cloak your weariness. By all ye cry or whisper, by all ye leave or do, the silent, sullen people shall weigh your gods and you. Take up the white man's burden, have done with childish days, the lightly profit laurel, the easy ungrudged praise. Come down to search your manhood through all of thankless years. No age with give or wisdom, the judgment of your peers. Take off the white man's burden through all of
And that was the excellent Chris Gard, of course. So do go and check out Chris Gard's YouTube channel. You can also find him on X. But he's got an excellent YouTube channel if you like good music. And he's also a friend of the channel and a good bloke. Good evening to my guests this evening, Aaron Hook, AI, and Mitch. And we're going to be talking mostly about the Battle of Britain and what I've described as the Sealion myth, because I don't think it would have ever come off. But we're going to start off by setting the scene a bit and talking about what is called appeasement, and also about a little bit about rearmament, Britain's rearmament specifically. And I'm going to hand it over to Aaron to start us off with the appeasement section.
With appeasement, it's a policy that doesn't sort of appear in the 1930s. It's effectively been British foreign policy towards Germany since the mid-20s. And so you see this in sort of the various treaties you have in the 20s where the British are very accommodating to the Germans. And you see this with the Locarno Pact, where essentially the British and the French essentially tell the Germans that if there is an invasion from the east, they can act militarily, which the Poles are not very pleased about. The Poles regard this as effectively the British and French giving the Germans a blank check to invade Poland. And so appeasement it obviously begins in the 20s and continues into the 30s, and it's through a mixture of wanting to constructively engage with Europe and also not wanting to fight another war. There's very much a sense, both the governing elite of Britain and also the public, of never again. That the First World War had been such a horrifying experience for them that the idea of fighting another world war was unthinkable. And so appeasement is as much the only possible policy that the British government could carry out in terms of engagement with Europe, as much as it is the wish for the British government to do it. The only other policy the British government could have done is returning to splendid isolation from, i.e. not involving itself in Europe at all, but that wasn't on the table. Engagement with Europe was very much regarded as a way of keeping the peace in Europe. And so when you get into the 30s, when you have the takeover of, when you have the establishment of the Third Reich, the British are very much trying to accommodate the Germans. It's not that the British government has any particular love for the German government, or for that matter, the Italian government, where there is also appeasement towards them. It's very much a sense that these are the people in power. They're men who we can do business with, as it were, to quote Margaret Thatcher. And so from 33 up until pretty much 37, the government, 37, 38, the government is trying to come to accommodation with the Germans. They do it through a number of ways, allowing the Germans to occupy the Rhineland, and also through the Anglo-German naval treaty, which essentially allows the Germans to operate freely from right Duke in the Baltic without British interference, if I remember that correctly.
Yeah, also it allows them to build up to, I think it was a third of the tonnage of the Royal Navy, but of course the Germans never came close to doing that at any stage, and could not have done. They just didn't have the shipyards apart from anything else.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, gentlemen, if people like AI and Mitch have something they want to say, please feel free to interrupt a suitable section.
I was going to say, like, with the stuff of the Anglo-German naval agreement, that very much. So Hitler read too much into it to the point where he thought that he could get away with a lot later on in his dealings with Chamberlain. Because he
wanted an alliance, as far as I could work out. He would have taken, if he could have got it, a British alliance. It was never going to happen, but that was really what he would have liked.
Yeah, because because I tried to read that very long, boring book of his like many moons back. But like one thing I remember was because he was commenting, for example, about how much he admired the British Empire in regards to how we administered India, but also he saw because the fact in the Anglo-Saxon, like we Anglo-Saxons originally came from northern Germany, so Mustache Man felt that we were natural allies to the Germans on a racial basis. So when you have someone like Chamberlain willing to reason with him, because you also got the fact that we opposed what the French did in 1923 regarding the Ruhr.
That was when they occupied the Ruhr.
Yeah. Mustache Man and Mustache Man was very much keen on perhaps getting an Anglo-German alliance further down the road because he thought, because we weren't as stringent about the Treaty of Versailles in the same way the French were, but even so, like it was a matter of, I'd agree.
We also weren't allied with the French in the 1920s and 30s in the same way that we had been prior to World War One. There was no entente. The French were relying for their security. I'm sure Aaron will talk about this a little bit in a minute, but the French for their security were relying on what was known as the Little Entente, which was really France's alliances with people like Czechoslovakia, which Britain didn't have. We had no alliances on the continent in the 20s and 30s. I'm happy to say, not that it in the end did us any good, of course, because we have idiots like Churchill who are desperate to go to war again. Just, I suspect, largely because he liked it. But anyway, as I said, AI, Mitch, if you've got stuff to say, please, you just interrupt in an appropriate place. Aaron, do carry on, mate, and also if you want to address anything that Mitch said there.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with what Mitch said very much so. And what you've also said, Jude, which is the Germans completely misread the British attitude. And a significant portion of this was down to von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister. Well, who became foreign minister? He served as ambassador to Britain from 1936 to 1938. And he 36 to 37, 38 possibly. But he, for example, is telling Hitler all sorts of things which are sort of nonsense. He was strutting around London acting like a complete arse, and he didn't understand the way that Britain worked. For example, he was convinced if he could get the king on side, the government would do what the king wanted. He didn't understand at all that the government didn't do the king's the personal bidding of the king. And so you have that going on with the Germans not at all understanding what the British are doing. The British are trying to come to an accommodation with the Germans, which is being made difficult both by this misunderstanding and also the fact that the Germans are throughout the 30s making rash decisions. So there's things like, though Britain was obviously had no problem with the reoccupation, the remilitarisation of the Rhineland. The British newspapers at the time, it was regarded as essentially the Germans walking back into their back garden. I remember one analogy, I think it was in the Times at the time, in the Times newspaper at the time, described as the equivalent of the British retaking the Isle of Wight. But the French went absolutely ballistic at this, and it was only the French military saying that they couldn't win the war, couldn't actually fight it without Britain, that stopped the French from militarily intervening in the Rhineland. And that also had the knock-on effect of making the Belgians, who had been in a formal alliance with unformal agreement with the British and the French over what would happen if the Germans went to war in the West again, to go neutral, and that completely ballsed up the French plans with the Maginot Line. And then in Eastern Europe, the British had good relations with quite a few regimes there. So, for example, the Hungarians under Admiral Horthy were very pro-British. The USSR were pro-British. and so were the Romanians. And the German actions over attempts in Austria, as well as the actions in Yugoslavia, put the British on the back foot because they did obviously, understandably, they didn't want to go to war because of what happened in 1914 over Czechoslovakia, which meant that the nations there decided that they needed to come to terms with Germany, which is probably the sensible thing to do given Britain is on the other side of Europe on an island. And this all, as Duke mentioned, meant that the little ententes in Eastern Europe came apart because these countries started looking towards Berlin as the new partner instead of Paris. And so the British are, as we get into 38 and then into early 39, the government is getting increasingly trying to come to terms with the German government, which is having absolutely no interest in keeping the peace. And I should say at this point, Hitler does not want a global war, but he is more than happy to have a war in Europe, particularly in Eastern Europe. He is absolutely beside himself in rage at Munich. Chamberlain and Daladier are able to get a peace agreement there. He wants his small war. He wants the German army to blood itself in Eastern Europe and show that it is a fit successor to the Imperial German Army of the First World War and of the Prussian Army before that. And so he is less than happy when when the Munich Agreement comes about. And so he hopes that there will be that. And so when they finally go to Czechoslovakia in March 39, he then turns his eye to Poland, and he, at that point, is using the claim for the Post Corridor and Danzig, which it should be pointed out that Danzig was itself ethnically German. I think the majority of the population was German, and they wanted to unite with Germany. And they'll Hitler pushing for that strongly. And the British government at that point is absolutely, at that point, it goes from trying to keep the peace to preparing itself for war. And this is particularly done by Chamberlain and his Francis Halifax. And they make sorry, go on, Drew. Go on, Mitch.
I was going to say, with the case of Czechoslovakia, it was a matter of, at that time, there were army officers, Ludwig Beck, I believe, was the main guy, plotting against Hitler at this point, because I believe there were German war plans about what's called Fort Case Green, which was a possible invasion of Czechoslovakia. Because Czechoslovakia had so many border fortifications, the Germans would find it very hard to break through, like the casualties would be extreme. So, in a way, it's like Hitler was so gung-ho about wanting a war, but if that war actually took place, as he wanted, he probably would have been removed from power by Ludwig Beck and a few of the others. Because at that time, it's like even with what happened with Anschluss earlier, the German army, if he was resisted against, they would have been chucked back because the army was not in the best position. And
yeah, they had a lot of breakdowns, Mitch. I was recently rereading Panzer General by Heinz Guderian, and he was not at all happy with the way the German panzers performed during the Anschluss with Austria, because they had loads of breakdowns, even though, of course, they didn't do any fighting.
Yeah,
the Austrians largely welcomed it.
Yeah, and the thing about the Czechoslovaks was because of Skoda, I think it's been a famous car company, they were producing loads of tanks for the Czechoslovak army. I think I can't remember
the Germans adopted two of them, Mitch. Like two of the Czech tanks were integrated and allowed Hitler to expand his panzer divisions.
I think it was something like 3 or 4 panzer divisions worth of armor was found in Czechoslovakia. Plus, that's so much weaponry. And another thing was apparently, I think like the German Abwehr, the spy service, they were telling Hitler about how there were secret meetings between the Czechoslovak High Command and the likes of Tukhachevsky in the Soviet Union. So this fueled a lot of rumours that the Czechoslovaks were collaborating with the Red Army. Now, I don't know how true that is because I haven't looked into it deeply, but this was often used to justify. But apparently, Chamberlain, I can't remember precisely Chamberlain's reaction. I think it was something like he wasn't fully aware of the Czechoslovaks working at times of the Soviet Union. Because you got back to Czechoslovaks were allied to the French, and the French, before the remilitarization of the Rhineland, had allied with the Soviet Union, or did at least some sort of treaty, like non-aggression pact, or something of that sort.
Yeah. There's also the fact that Germany had originally had an alliance with Poland, and if the Polish government, and of course, it's as well that people these days remember that the Polish government in 1938 and 1939 was itself a military dictatorship. Poland was not some poor little democracy.
They fought. I believe it was in the 1920s. They fought off the Soviet Union.
They did. They absolutely did. Yes.
They fought off them, particularly a very onslaught of Bolsheviks, and
they did indeed. The trouble was that the Polish military dictatorship, which was in place in the 1930s, hadn't modernized the Polish army very much. So it was still very much a First World War type army. But Hitler would probably have accepted some sort of alliance with Poland, providing, as Aaron was saying a few minutes ago, provided he could have got a corridor across to Danzig, which is the main thing he was bothered about.
Yeah, I think because the thing about the Polish was originally they were willing to give up Danzig because they had a port at a place called, I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation, Gdynia, I believe it's called, or something like that.
Yeah. Can I just say, sorry to interrupt you, Mitch, I just want to say to people in the chat, we will do a stream about the Battle of Waterloo at some stage. This is not a Battle of Waterloo stream. So going on about the Battle of Waterloo in the chat is not going to get you many answers off the blokes today. But we will indeed do a stream about Waterloo at some point. And no, Wellington did not totally depend on the Irish, nor did he depend on Rothschild. But anyway, that's a stream for another day. If you have specific questions on this subject, or you would just like to support the channel, you can do so via Entropy. And there is a link to the Entropy thing that is pinned to the top of the chat. I beg your pardon, Mitch, do carry on, mate.
I was just saying, so you have the Germans, for example. They one thing that's not really well known. I don't know if Aaron mentioned earlier, but so the Germans were secretly rearming during the 1920s under Weimar through the Treaty of Rapallo. So even under Weimar Germany, they were still having like an aircraft training school. I can't remember if they have the training schools based in Russia.
Yes.
I'm sorry. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say now, the way that they did in the Weimar Republic was they opened up. You had like for the army, you had like shooting clubs, and you had like air clubs. I forgot, or they called it Luft, something or other. Basically, it was meant to be like just like a sort of a hobby thing. So that was like the sort of technicality of getting around the Treaty of Versailles. But the thing is, even though the army was pretty much, I mean, the navy was sort of done away with, there was no air force, and the army was greatly reduced. The officer corps, the old Prussian officer corps, still remained in place. And if you actually do and you know, this isn't the stream for it, but if you ever look into the rise of the National Socialists, one thing you find is very quickly, and this is where you have the contention with the SA, Ernst Röhm and Hitler, is where you had the I guess you say the Prussian military corps wanting to go in one direction against sort of the party machine, and so you know, and Hitler had that obviously, you know, was getting sick and tired of Ernst Röhm and the SA being unruly. But I mean, ultimately, if you look at a map of the Second Polish Republic in 1930, say, the Pomerania, Poznan, and Lodz, and the Warsaw district, all of that was Prussian territory. And you had High German, the majority of Danzig, for example, and the Danzig corridor, they were populated by Germans, but a very large German population also existed in those areas as well. So looking into it, it actually seems more of just the old Prussian elite really wanting to reclaim those lands. And I know it's all tied up in the party and various myths that come later on, but I do think that that Hitler and was. He agreed with the principle by that officer corps, but I actually think they were more of a driving factor in this than history tends to give them credit for.
Yeah, I think there's some truth in that, and also, of course, the Germans did have under Weimar, they did have a tank school in the Soviet Union, and also they had a secret air force base in the Soviet Union. And as AI was saying, they did indeed start a lot of flying and glider clubs and what have you for young people as another way of building up their pilot base. One thing they couldn't do, however, was get more trained manpower, because the Reichswehr, which was the German army at that time, was limited to 100,000 men. That's still considerably bigger than the modern British Army, by the way, which is about 70,000 now. But they were limited to 100,000 men. And that meant that even by World War II, and of course, Hitler brought conscription back in about 1936, I think. I'm sure Aaron will correct me if I'm wrong. But when Hitler brought conscription back in, that couldn't make up for all those years when conscripts weren't going through the German army and being basically trained, which is the advantage of having a conscript army. It means that if you do go to war, when you call up people who've already done 2 years in the military, they have a basic understanding and it's much quicker to train them.
I actually think you're right, Iron Duke. It was the conscription because, of course, it coincided at the same time as the Spanish Civil War, which was a very important factor in German remilitarization. Because a lot of people actually thought at the time that another European war would be in and around Spain, because of course the German and Italian governments backing the nationalist cause, and the Soviets and other communist, like Mexico and other allies backing the Republicans in Spain, and
I'm just conscious that mostly on this stream, what I want to talk about is the British, because this whole channel is based on British and old Commonwealth history. And so I am conscious that I want to concentrate more on the British side of things than the German side of things, or interesting as that is. And we can possibly do it on a different stream. But Aaron, maybe you'd like to carry on with the appeasement side of things that will also in turn lead into British rearmament, which starts very late in about 1937.
Yeah, actually, I'm just going to go back to something AI mentioned, because it will actually lead straight on to British.
Go for it, mate.
Right, so AI mentioned the fact that the German officer called the Prussian officers wanted to take back that land, and you've probably, I know everybody on the stream will have heard this, and probably a lot of the audience will have, the concept of Lebensraum, land in the east. Now, that is not a Nazi idea. That is an idea that goes back in German nationalist thinking to the late 19th century. And so when the Germans dismember Czechoslovakia, they then turn their eyes to Poland. It should point out that Poland took part in the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia, taking out small areas along the northern border. And this is what really gets Britain sort of on the road to war in March 1939, because what happens is that the the Romanians watch the build-up of the Hungarians going into Czechoslovakia, and they send their minister in London around telling everybody who will listen that the Romanians are next on the chopping block, and so, which is utterly false. We still don't know to this day whether the Romanian government, whether the Romanian minister in London was saying that honestly, that he believed it, or he was lying. Either way, that sort of scares the horses in London. And then when the Germans go up against Poland, start making their claims against Poland, that's when the issue what is known as the Polish Guarantee, which essentially says that Britain will defend Poland's territorial integrity. And that's the thing that will ultimately lead to, in September 1939, to British and French entry into what would have been otherwise a German-Polish war. Now, Duke has mentioned already that British rearmament began quite late, 1937. This is in part due to the fact that there was that sense of British not of sort of resistance to the idea of going to war again, never again. And in 1934, there was a by-election after the British government had suggested they might carry out a bit of extremely limited rearmament, and there was a candidate put up by the Peace Pledge Union, which was wholly opposed to a war, full stop, and that candidate won on an anti-war, anti-rearmament platform. And so one of the reasons why the British government is so late to rearming is because it is politically impossible to do so. And as Mitch and Sia absolutely so, the great irony of Labour doing that is at the same time Labour calling for opposing rearmament, but they were also calling for the British government to oppose the Germans even more strongly. And you can't do that. For Britain to confront the Germans in a more strong fashion.
That's so typically socialist, Darren. That is so typically socialist, to call the two completely opposite things at the same time. And of course, when Britain did rearm, it was mostly the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force. The Army got the crumbs, basically.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, you're quite right. And I think part of the reason for that is the fact that there was inside on the back benches you had three men who were arguing for the three services. Winston Churchill is the most famous one because he was arguing for the RAF. You had Admiral Sir Roger Keyes, who had been the man who had led the Zebra Brigade in 1918. He was advocating strongly for the Navy, and he was allied throughout the 30s. And then the man advocating for the Army was Neville Chamberlain's elder brother and the former Foreign Secretary, Sir Austin Chamberlain, who died not long after Neville Chamberlain became Prime Minister. And so I think one of the reasons why the Army got less than it should have is partly down to him. It's also partly down to the fact that the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force are fundamentally, at that point, definitely the Royal Navy are more important, shall we say, than the Army in terms of British defence.
Yeah, I mean, look, from an imperial point of view, obviously the Navy is the most important thing, and the British Empire was still a thing in the 1930s. And Britain was facing three possible enemies at this stage, which was Germany, Italy, mostly in the Mediterranean, and of course Japan in the Far East. And the only thing that could conceivably defend the British Empire against all those threats was the Royal Navy. And then from the Air Force's point of view, a thing had risen up in the 1930s that the bomber would always get through. You know, the Air Force bomber would always get through, and whole cities would be laid waste in no time whatsoever. Of course, this actually happened in World War II, but not to the British, to the Germans. But it was really vastly exaggerated in the 1930s, and we're going to come on to talk about the Battle of Britain in a minute, where the Germans, in daylight anyway, were certainly not able to raise cities all over the place. Certainly not with their the sort of aircraft they had in 1939 and 1940. So the RAF was important. The Brits were spending a lot of money, as Mitch is saying in the chat, on radar and stuff like this, which was very, very important. It was an enormous force multiplier for the defence, because if you had radar, you didn't need to keep standing patrols in the air all the time. You could simply send aircraft up to intercept raids that you could see on the radar. So that was vastly important. And also quite expensive. And of course, the RAF was, because it was not modernized too early, was able to modernize with really good aircraft like the Hawker Hurricane and the Supermarine Spitfire, which were very, very good day fighters. I mean, the Spitfire in particular was able to be developed all the way through the war and was still a extremely good fighter plane in 1945 with a much bigger engine and other changes. So anyway, yeah. So you can see why the British defence spending mostly went on the Navy and the Air Force, but also, of course, by not spending so much money on the Army, the government was placating the anti-war people, because mainly what these guys were worried about was a return to World War I trench warfare. But anyway, with that, I'll hand it over to Aaron again.
Yeah, and actually, on what when Duke mentioned, the bomb will always get through. If you want to get a good idea of what people, in terms of visually, what people thought an air raid would look like, there's a film from 1937 called Things to Come, based on a H.G. Wells novel, and the opening scene is set in 1940, and it's when a European war has broken out, and you get to see an air raid on London, and that gives you a really good idea of the real fears that people had when it came to that concept of the bomber will always get through. And I can also highly recommend the film in general. It is really good. Now
I was so sorry to interrupt, Aaron, but I'm aware of that film because for many people who are into more conspiracy sides, particularly around the Second World War and Britain's entry, would argue that that film was basically prepping. It was like prepping the British public for World War, in the sense that even down to the date of bombings.
Well, interestingly, that film was seen at the time as being a pro-fascist film, particularly pro-BUF. So I think that might be people.
I know nothing about this, so yeah. I'm not going to comment. But you could be right, Aaron. You could be right, AI. I'm not sure. I know that Aaron is very much into his movie history and film history. So yeah.
Yeah, I've actually never heard that AI, but I think that might be people back projecting, to be honest, because at the time, people. I'm sorry.
I heard it. You know, like the Last Battle of Europe, that documentary that's you see every about, and there are things in there which are interesting. There are things in there that you can question. I saw it. I remember I saw that on a comment thread that they wanted to find people were pointing out films or things where there was basically prepping the British public for conflict. And that one was what came up. Yeah, or prepping the idea of like bombing raids and things like that.
I mean, the old things are going to change, but I don't think that I'm skeptical of that, purely because when the film came out, the Spanish Civil War was going on, and you had all the footage from there. I think this came out just around it may have come out around the same time as Guernica. So I think I doubt that very much. I doubt it was some kind of some preparation for it.
It was very much the bomber will always get through was very much a public topic in the 1930s. I mean, it was almost you could, in some ways, you could compare it to the threat of nuclear war during the Cold War. It was everyone thought that cities would all get laid waste quite quickly in another big war, and there were airmen in Britain like Trenchard There was Druitt in Italy, and people like Billy Mitchell in the USA. These bomber supporters who were not right, by the way, certainly not in the 1930s, were very much bigging up how bombers would make all other forms of warfare obsolete. You know, like there'd be no point in having fleets or armies because cities would just be destroyed by bombers. And ridiculous as that was, it was very widely believed. I mean, I think it was Stanley Baldwin who said the bomber will always get through. Actually, wasn't it, Aaron?
Yes, he did. Well, I'm not sure if he coined it, but he used it quite a lot.
Yes,
he was associated with him.
Sorry, Mitch, you were trying to say something, Mitch.
I was just say, I know that also in the late 30s, early 40s, there's also fear that bombers would drop gas all over British cities. So
yes, indeed.
We had an unfortunate situation where lots of people had their pets put down because they were all scared that the pets were all going to die from the bombs and the gas. And then it turned out none of that ever happened.
In 1940, not only were all the adults issued and children issued with gas masks, which they were supposed to carry with them everywhere, they even had special gas cradles for babies that were you could buy or were issued. I'm not sure which it was. They really did think that, you know, there'd be gas dropped on cities, which, by the way, would have caused many casualties. But of course, no one did it because everyone was afraid other countries would do it back to them. And even Hitler never used gas.
Yeah, I mean, actually, Hitler's sort of fear of using gas from the First World War, and one reason
he'd been gassed himself, hadn't he, Aaron?
Yeah, and then one of his big fears was, as you mentioned, that other countries would use gas if he used it, particularly the British would use this, which, given some of the plans for the beaches if the Germans had invaded, which we'll come to eventually, his fears were somewhat justified, shall we say.
Yes, indeed.
Sorry to ask, did the Japanese ever use gas in China?
There are rumours that they did. There's also rumours that the Italians used some in Abyssinia.
Abyssinia, I heard about the Abyssinians.
It would have been it was pretty small scale, though, in both cases, to be honest.
I know.
And of course, the Abyssinians and the Chinese couldn't retaliate, which is the only reason it was used. You know, if you used gas on London, then Britain would certainly have used it on Berlin and other German cities. And as Aaron was alluding to just now, and we'll come to talk about this in a minute, Winston Churchill had no worries about using gas whatsoever because he was a pretty nasty man, to be honest.
Yeah, I know that the Japanese, they did use gas at the Battle of Wuhan in 1938. I can't think of any other time when the Japanese used it. As for the Italians, there was they used it because apparently Mussolini they had the Ethiopian Christmas offensive that didn't go Mussolini's way. So once it became offensive season, once more of spring onward, that's really when you get people talking about gas being used, especially in a lot of big battles, supposedly where, let's say, the Ethiopians attack and let's say they temporarily overrun the position. Apparently, this is, I don't know how true this is because I'm not particularly one who studied it, but you know, but there's also stories of Ethiopians doing nasty stuff to Italian POWs. So it's kind of
which they did, yes, which they did.
Yeah.
And the war in China was extremely savage anyway. So, you know.
I should say I don't know about Ethiopia, but I do know that the Italians did use gas against the Senussi rebels in Libya in the 20s. So I would suspect if they did use it in Ethiopia, if there are rumours that they used it in Ethiopia, I'd imagine their rumours have probably got some truth to them.
Yeah, the only reason gas wasn't used in World War II was everyone was frightened that if they used it, the other countries would use it against them. That was the only reason it wasn't used. So, you know, it was not a humanitarian thing at all. It was just people were frightened of retaliation, really.
Well, it's kind of like how in the modern age nukes have become irrelevant. Like, say, like, look at Ukraine and Russia today. I mean, there's no real talks
Russia
of
could
nukes.
Russia could nuke Ukraine to death in a day if it really wanted to, but of course it won't do that. No.
And it's never crossed any of their minds. It's never crossed Putin or any of his people's minds to do that. And
no,
for that reason.
Absolutely true. But that was the only reason gas was not used. However, we've been going 45 minutes, and we haven't even really talked too much about rearmament yet. So I'm going to let Aaron carry on with his political side of things.
Yes, so by 36, 37, the countries come around to the idea of rearmament, at least in terms of the Royal Navy and the RAF. Not so much the Army, as Duke has mentioned, because of worries of World War I style red warfare. And so the rearmament is taking place both officially and unofficially. There are what are called shadow factories, which are private sort of industry, are being contracted under the table, as it were, by the British government to start rearming, as well as there being a formal process of rearmament. And this continues through 37, 38 into 39. And then in 39, things become a lot more, especially after the complete annexation of Czechoslovakia, more formal, more overt, to the degree that you start getting military training for men over the age of 18 up until about 25 in March. There's an Act of Parliament passed in April 39, that effectively is starting to give men military training.
So conscription, in other words, Aaron.
It's conscription in everything but name, essentially. And so this is continuing through the spring of 1939, and rearmament is sort of picking up pace. It's nowhere near where it should be, but as I mentioned before, as Duke mentioned before, it was pretty much before 1937 politically impossible to rearm in any serious way because the country simply wouldn't have worn it.
Yeah, and it's also worth pointing out that the Royal Navy, for example, which was the most important British service, was working on the basis that the war would break out in 1942. But there again, none of the admirals thought the British government would be stupid enough to give the war button to the military dictatorship in Poland. Which, of course, had no effect because Hitler simply didn't believe that Britain and France would go to war because he knew damn well we couldn't do anything to help Poland. And I had no intention of doing so either, which is why you got the long period of the so-called phony war.
Yeah,
it wasn't phony for the Poles or the Germans, but it was very phony for the Brits and the French.
And it should. Now, I think at this point we might just want to mention, just to add a bit of context to this, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, because this comes about. It's a reaction to the British and French giving their guarantee to Poland, and
completely stymies them from that point of view. Like Britain and France did actually send a military legation to see Stalin, but we sent him by ship. The officer who was sent was not senior enough and had no authority to agree to anything. So it was completely pointless, basically.
Yeah. Just to go on a slight note, Duke, the man who was sent, Drax, has two sort of literary claims to fame. He's the one he was a friend of Ian Fleming, and he's the one who Hugo Drax is named after, who's a villain in Moonraker. Mm-hmm. And also, he happened to be the brother of Lord Dunsany, the fantasy and horror writer. So, a man with strange connections. As you said, he was sent off on this mission by boat to negotiate with Stalin, but that was never going to come to terms. And what essentially what you get with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is effectively what the Germans have been doing during the Weimar period on steroids and open, where they are agreeing, they're doing trade deals, and they are carving up Eastern Europe between them.
Yes, there were secret protocols in that agreement that basically, as Aaron said, that Stalin and Hitler carved up Eastern Europe between them. The Soviets invaded Poland when they were already almost defeated by the Germans. The Soviets were also sending the Germans huge amounts of raw materials and what have you, and they continued doing so up to the very day of Barbarossa in 1941.
Yeah, the fuel in the tanks of the tanks during the Battle of France and in the various aircraft of Luftwaffe came from the Soviet oil fields.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and it made the British blockade very ineffective.
Yeah, and also there are also conferences in Poland in 1940, which are joint conferences between the Gestapo and the NKVD, where they are swapping intelligence and they are swapping effectively people in their swapping people. So a lot of the German Communist Party, the KDP, who are sheltering in the Soviet Union, are sent back to Germany under these agreements, whilst various somewhat Russians and various Russian, Soviet dissidents are sent that are in Germany, still in Germany, are sent back to the Soviet Union.
Yes,
and
in fact, if you were a white Russian, it was not a good idea to be sent back to the Soviet Union.
No. As they would discover at the end of the war, which is a topic for another day, shall we say.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, the one thing that did happen and is worth mentioning in the phony war, there was quite a lot of naval action during the phony war, although it is worth emphasizing the German Navy was tiny in 1939 compared to the Royal Navy. But one of the actions that people should know about is that the Royal Navy destroyed the so-called pocket battleship Graf Spee off South America. And the pocket battleship is a nonsense. They weren't pocket battleships. They were called that because they had 6 11-inch guns on them. But they were, in fact, large, heavy cruisers, really, in terms of their armor and this kind of stuff. And as it happened, 3 quite small British cruisers were able to defeat Graf Spee. And had the 4th cruiser that was meant to be with that squadron been there, which was a more powerful ship, the Graf Spee might well have been sunk. But as it happened, she was merely damaged and then scuttled herself, and then her captain committed suicide.
Yeah, I think the thing was the German Navy, or Kriegsmarine, they had like a massive internal schism about what they should do, because you had on one hand like Erich Raeder, who he thought that war would because most of the Kriegsmarine were like, okay, most Kriegsmarine sailors and whatnot, they knew full well if war were to happen with us, the British, they'd have no chance, just like in the First World War. However, there was still a sense of like, you had what was called Plan Z, which was to build up a massive navy. But even by 1943, let alone like.
Oop. Hang on. There you go.
I think like I think there was a situation where certain German dockyards that were meant to be building capital ships got rediverted to building like cruise ships for that Strength Through Joy program, like the Wilhelm Gustloff, that was commissioned, instead of building more cruisers and destroyers. So it was kind of like the Plan Z was half-hearted at best in terms of building a massive German navy to counter us.
We'll come on to the German and British navies in a little bit when we talk about the Sealion myth. It is worth mentioning in terms of the British Army, which definitely was getting the least amount of funding, However, it is worth mentioning that the British Army, unlike the Germans, was totally motorized by the time the war broke out. There were no more horses in the British Army. In fact, that's not quite true. There were still a few horsed cavalry regiments, but they were in the Middle East, in places like Palestine. But there were only a few of them left, and they were territorial units by this stage. They were like part-time soldiers. Well, part-time soldiers who got called up for the war, of course. But basically, the British Army that was sent to France in 1939 was entirely motorized, which was something the German army was never entirely motorized. Only the Panzer and motorized divisions were motorized. The rest of them depended on horse-drawn transport. And in fact, Germany even had a cavalry division all the way through the war.
Yeah, didn't the French along the French had still relied on horse-drawn transport?
Did. Yes,
yeah.
in quite a lot of their infantry divisions, yes, they did. The French army was only partially motorized, but the British army, which of course, to be fair, was a lot smaller than the German or the French army. The British army was entirely motorized, so it was up to date in that respect, at least.
Yeah, because
I'm sorry.
I was going to say, because of course when the Germans passed through the Ardennes, that is what really caused the problem for the French, is that they were just, not the fact that they were, I mean, yeah, they were surrounded and overrun, but it was also they couldn't maneuver to reposition themselves against the Germans effectively. I mean, you did have, I believe, at the start of the the Phoney War process, you did have the French launch an attack. I think it was on the Saarland, the Saar region.
Yeah, they didn't go very far, AI.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't like a successful, but they did, technically cross into the Saar region on an assault. But I mean, it didn't really come to anything. But there wasn't any German armor or anything, but at that point. But it was more like, I mean, it's probably more like a glorified raid if you were to be a bit more generous with it. But yeah,
pretty much. And look, I don't want to go too much into the Battle of France here because it's not appropriate for what we're talking about today. But it is worth pointing out that the Royal Navy were the people who rescued the British Expeditionary Force. I mean, we have the legend of all the little boats and stuff. And in those little boats did indeed go across to Dunkirk. But what they were mostly used for was ferrying troops from the beaches to bigger ships like ferries and also Royal Navy destroyers above all else. And the Luftwaffe, who had been given the task of stopping the British Expeditionary Force from leaving, the Panzer units were basically stopped. And they did indeed need to do repairs and stuff and maintenance. But the German Luftwaffe was given the job of stopping the British from being evacuated, and they didn't really succeed. They did actually sink a number of Royal Navy destroyers, but the reason they were able to do so is when those destroyers were stopped and taking on troops. And also, even when they pulled away from the beaches, they usually had so many troops on them, they couldn't actually use their guns very effectively because they were so packed with soldiers. And this was the reason that the Royal Navy did lose some destroyers off Dunkirk, but they didn't lose that many, to be honest. It was the Navy that saved the British Army more than anything else. Without a powerful Royal Navy, the British Expeditionary Force would have been captured, basically.
It's a bit of a far cry from that the recent film of Dunkirk by the director. I forgot.
Oh,
his name
Nolan.
Now,
Nolan.
Yeah, Nolan. Yeah, where basically the Navy was on its last legs, and it was the plucky RAF that came in to save the day and the evacuation sort of thing.
Yeah, that was probably why when the soldiers got back to England, they were beating up RAF members And the reason they were doing it is they didn't see very many RAF planes while they were at Dunkirk. In fact, the RAF were trying to intercept the German raids on Dunkirk, but they were doing it behind the beaches where the troops couldn't see them. But yeah, it was the Navy that were basically the heroes of Dunkirk more than anybody else, as was so often the case in World War II. We need to talk very briefly about the Norwegian campaign, which was prior to the Battle of France. And this was a Churchill idea. And because it was a Churchill idea, it wasn't planned very well, because Churchill wasn't very good at planning, to say the least. And on land, it was a disaster, generally speaking. But at sea, it was a huge success. The Royal Navy actually sank, with some Norwegian help. The Royal Navy actually, and the Norwegians, sank almost half the German Navy in Norway. The Germans lost 2 cruisers, one sunk by the Norwegians and one sunk by the British Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm by dive bombers. And they also lost 12 destroyers, which was about half their destroyer fleet, or almost half of it anyway. So the German Navy in 1940 was far weaker than it was in 1939 when the war broke out. And this is important and will be important when we come to talk about the Battle of Britain and the Sealion stuff. Aaron, carry on, mate.
I'm just going to mention just a couple of things. One, in addition to being mechanised, the British Expeditionary Force was also armed with what was probably the best light machine gun in the world at that point, which was a brain gun, giving the British advantage through that. And
very true.
Also, one of the reasons why the Germans were so successful in their invasion of France using their panzers was because, unlike the French, the Germans had radios in their tanks, so they could communicate better. And
they also had 3-man turrets in their best tanks, whereas the French turrets were mostly one guy, and that meant that who was the commander of the tank, and that meant he had to command the tank, find targets, and also load the gun, which was far too much of a workload for one guy. And the 3-man turrets became the norm in tanks, and for a good reason.
Yeah. And now, when the Norway fiasco takes place, Chamberlain gets the blame for it because he's the Prime Minister. And to be fair, he was the one who signed off on it. Churchill would definitely, being Churchill's plan, it was badly planned. But when you're Prime Minister, the book stops with you. And so Chamberlain takes the fall for that. There is a vote in the House of Commons. The government wins it, but enough of the government backbenchers vote against the government to tell Chamberlain it's time to go. So then he offers he says, he goes to the king and says there's two people to take the post, either Churchill or Halifax. And there is a meeting between Halifax and Churchill where they're both sitting in the room, and essentially it's going to be the first one who speaks is going to be Prime Minister, and Churchill's the first one. And he says, I think I should be Prime Minister. And Halifax says, I rather think you should. And I think, now people do counterfactuals and say if Halifax became Prime Minister, Britain would have negotiated with the Germans. Probably would have been talked with the Germans, but they wouldn't have come to anything, purely because the Germans would have wanted Gibraltar, Malta and Egypt to hand over to, respectively, the Spanish and the Italians. And so Halifax as an ardent British imperialist, first and foremost, would never have actually accept that. And so Halifax would have fought on, and quite probably, from his own memoirs later on, have resigned the premiership and handed it over to Churchill anyway. So Churchill becoming Prime Minister in May was sort of, from the point Chamberlain resigns, becomes sort of the inevitable. It's sort of inevitable.
Yeah. I just want to reply to Level 98 Bear Hunting Armor in the chat. He's talking about the German battleship Scharnhorst and Gneisenau sinking the Royal Navy carrier Glorious. Now, Glorious was an old carrier, but quite a large one. And her sinking is, there's still some mystery around it, and there are still some things related to it which have not been released to the public. It's very strange because she only had 2 destroyers as escort, when in peacetime Royal Navy carriers normally had at least 4 destroyers as escorts. And of course, a destroyer is a threat to a battleship because of the torpedoes on them. Also, she had no aircraft on deck, and certainly no aircraft patrolling overhead. And had she done so, because she was a pretty fast ship, if she'd have spotted Gneisenau and Scharnhorst early enough, she could have ran away, to be honest. Yeah, there's still some stuff about that which has not been released to the public. So there's obviously some sort of scandal involved in it, which the government still wants to keep secret. That was all I had to say, guys. So anyway, let's move on to the famous Battle of Britain. And I don't want to give anything like a blow-by-blow account of the Battle of Britain. It's been done to death. There's a million videos and stuff you can watch about it. The RAF had 600 odd Spitfires and Hurricanes. They were mostly Hurricanes, but they were about two-thirds Hurricanes and a third Spitfires. They had about 750 pilots, I think, at the Battle of Britain. They were training pilots as quickly as they could. They also took pilots from the Fleet Air Arm into the RAF temporarily. They didn't really have a problem with Spitfires and Hurricanes. They were building them very quickly. Britain was already building aircraft more quickly than the Germans in 1940. So there wasn't really a lack of planes, but there was certainly there was a shortage of pilots. Even though, as I say, they were taking Royal Navy Fleet Air Arms pilots. They were also taking some from Bomber Command, particularly from things like Fairey Battle Squadrons. The Fairey Battle was a very useless and vulnerable single-engine bomber, and they took some of those guys in to fly Spitfires and Hurricanes. The German Air Force was much bigger than the RAF, but its number of single-engine fighters was not hugely bigger. I mean, I think they had, 800 or so Messerschmitt 109s. The Messerschmitt 109 was a little bit better than the Hurricane, and it was about the same as the Spitfire, probably a little bit worse. So that kind of balanced out. The German Me-110 two-engined destroyer heavy fighters were pretty useless. They were almost as vulnerable as the bombers. And the German bombers, which were all medium bombers, relatively mid-size, were very vulnerable. Even though RAF fighters at this time only had 8 rifle caliber machine guns, which was not the best armament, they were still able to ruin German unescorted bomber formations.
Well, are these the Heinkel's?
The Germans used quite a few different planes. They had the Dornier 17 bomber, they had the Heinkel 111 bomber, and they also had the rather better Junkers 88 bomber. The Germans did initially use their Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers, particularly against channel convoys, but they were such a sitter for fighters, they had to withdraw them. Like they had such huge losses that Germans stopped using the Ju-87 fairly quickly because they couldn't survive over England, or even in the Channel. Is just asking how different was the Bf 109's range to the Hurricane and Spitfire. It was about the same, mate. They were all really interceptor fighters. None of them were long range. And at that stage, nobody had long-range tanks for fighter aircraft. So they were pretty similar in range.
I was going to say, correct me if I'm wrong on this, and people. My impression on the Battle of Britain was that at the start of it, the Germans targeted the airfields. The bombers particularly targeted the airfields. And then Goering, the decision was then made to target basically East End London and more urban cities, particularly manufacturing, and the airfields were left alone. And was sort of, I think it was Adolf Galland, who was like a well-known German, particularly in the post-war period, sort of viewed that as like a mistake. There was like one of the German mistakes in the
Galland became the general of fighters during the war, and he was a big-time German ace. He was a very good pilot. However, the switch from bombing the airfields, which was how they started, and you're right about that, AI, although they were also trying to bomb aircraft factories, not very successfully, and Royal Navy bases and so on, again, not all that successfully. But the switch really came because Churchill was bombing Berlin, and Hitler eventually got annoyed with this and thought, right, okay, we're going to bomb London. And it was more Hitler's decision than it was Goering's.
Okay. Yes. Yeah, okay, that makes sense now, yeah.
But they were the Luftwaffe were having some success with bombing airfields, particularly the airfields that were right on the coast, close to France, because they got far less warning. Because although radar would pick up the Germans as they were forming up over France, it's only a few minutes to get across the Channel, even in World War II aircraft. They're traveling at 200 odd miles an hour. So,
I mean, for example, I know that the Germans, when they was, like for example, when there was the bombing of, was it Newcastle Northeast, when they flew across from Norway. I mean, that was quickly abandoned because it was just there was no way that they could have fighter escort
yes,
at all, and so. And if you've anyone seen the film Battle of Britain, you have the famous line of where they say, "Help yourself, everybody. There's no fighter escort," because it was just they're just able to take out all the bombers coming in, and so that was a disaster. But even with London, even with the bombing of London, and cities in the south, you still had that limited range where the bombers had that final stretch into London. You got the map up there. Final stretch in London, that was for the bombers, for them to then to. And how many minutes did they have? Was it like 40 minutes or something like that?
No. The German Bf 109s, their single engine fighters, could spend a whole 5 minutes over London. 5 minutes they had. And that was as far as they could possibly go. If they didn't leave after 5 minutes, they were going to crash into the Channel on the way back to France.
Yeah, but that was the same for the what was the bombers then?
No, the bombers could fly all over the place. They had a much longer range, but the point is the bombers couldn't survive without a fighter escort. The problem, AI, was the bombers had a much longer range. That wasn't an issue, but they couldn't survive without a fighter escort.
Yeah, that's what I mean. The fighter escort was limited, and so the final stretch had to be done by the bombers exclusively. I do know, during the Battle of Britain, you had one instance where Plymouth was bombed, quite badly actually. It was quite a bad bombing run. Apparently that was mixed up. The Germans mixed up Exeter and Plymouth.
Yeah, that used to happen quite a lot. I mean, navigation was not fabulous in the early stages of World War II.
Yeah,
but the point I would like to make is that one of the things about the Battle of Britain, which no one ever talks about, and by the way, do not get me wrong here. I am in no way criticizing the courage of the RAF fighter pilots. They were very brave young men. and were often very badly outnumbered. Very, very brave men. And I'm in no way criticizing them at all. But one of the things that is never talked about in the Battle of Britain was that had the RAF been having a worse time than it in fact had, it could have withdrawn. The RAF Fighter Command could have withdrawn north of London, and the Germans basically couldn't have done anything because they couldn't escort their bombers that far. So if the Battle of Britain had gone more badly for the RAF Fighter Command than in fact it did, the RAF Fighter Command could simply have withdrawn north of London. They could still have intercepted the Germans over London and over the home counties. But the Germans it would have been impossible for the Germans to effectively bomb the bases north of London because their fighters simply didn't have the range to get there.
Well,
Yeah,
the RAF, the RAF divided Britain up into like like they're each like zone. So you had like Wales in the southwest, and then you had
there were groups, and the one covering the southeast was 11 Group.
11 Group, yeah. I mean, yeah, you're right, because some parts they saw very few action compared to that, and they could have also moved aircraft around. Pilots around, groups around, if needed.
Well, to some extent they did that. Like if a squadron was heavily engaged and it had been in, say, Sussex, and had fought very hard and lost quite a lot of pilots, they would move them up to Scotland or somewhere for a few months to give the pilots a rest and to enable them to take in new pilots from the training schools.
Mm.
Yeah. One thing about Britain, I mean, first of all, let's say for argument's sake, you had a German pilot who had to parachute from his aircraft. He was going to be captured over here, so he was dead with clearance anyway. Whereas if a British or indeed Commonwealth or Allied aircrew were to be parachuted over, they can get swiftly back in the air like an hour later. So purely
providing they weren't injured, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so attritionally, the Germans could not win because, well, there's also I believe that it was around this time that we discovered that salt water being like okay for being a lot better for healing like burn victims, because apparently they noticed that with, let's say, survivors of air crashes on land, if they were to get burnt up, the burns wouldn't heal as well as if they were in salt water. So
yeah, there was also Mitch. There were also a lot of the early advances in plastic surgery came from treating burned pilots.
Yeah,
because in a plane like a Spitfire or a Hurricane, and also in the German 109, you were literally sitting on one of the fuel tanks.
I mean, yeah. Referring back to the Battle of Britain film, there's a character in there who's a pilot who's visibly burned. Now,
Yes,
I believe he is actually a veteran.
Yeah, he was.
From
He
the Battle of
was a
Britain.
real RAF. I don't know if he was from the Battle of Britain, but he was certainly a World War II RAF veteran. Yes.
I think he was the Battle of Britain, but he was meant to be playing like an older,
Yes.
an older character. But I think he was a Battle of Britain, because one of the characters he interacts with sort of suffers what I think he suffered. I remember there was an interview done about that. It was Christopher Plummer's character, who had suffered the burns.
Yes.
Yeah.
Baron Badger's asking about the Poles. There were a couple of squadrons in RAF Fire Command of Poles who had escaped from Poland. There was also a Czechoslovak squadron, and there was even an American squadron in the RAF of American volunteers in the Battle of Britain. But overall, the vast majority of the pilots were either British or from the old Commonwealth. So there were a lot of Australians, a lot of New Zealanders, a lot of South Africans. One of the leading aces in the Battle of Britain in Fire Command was a guy called Sailor Milan, who came from Cape Town. So yeah, and there were also Rhodesians and what have you.
Yeah,
as
a
well.
couple of Rhodesians. Yeah, there was a couple of Rhodesians.
So the most of the pilots were either British or were from the old Commonwealth. New Zealanders as well, of course, and Canadians. There were quite a few Canadians. And as I said, the RAF was short of pilots. It wasn't quite as desperate as some people made it out at the time, but they were quite short of pilots at that time. And but they weren't short of aircraft. British factories were producing Hurricanes and Spitfires at a faster rate than the Germans were building their aircraft, even in 1940. And eventually, of course, they built something like I think it was 14,000 Hurricanes and 20,000 Spitfires. But anyway, yeah. So the Battle of Britain was going to be very difficult for the Brits to actually lose, to be honest. Is the major point I would like to make. But I'll go around the rest of the panel and they can make their points about the Battle of Britain, starting with you, Aaron. Any points you want to make about the Battle of Britain?
Just to say that I agree with you, Duke. It would have been not impossible or close to it for the British to have lost. Or even
they would have had to have been incompetent to have lost totally. Yeah.
That's pretty much all I've got to say.
Mitch, anything?
Yeah, I don't see a realistic scenario where Sealion ever happens. I mean, you get a lot of alternate history scenarios where the Germans win over us, but well, you know.
Well, that's what we're going to move on to next, Mitch.
Yeah,
so we're going to move on to Sealion next. But at this stage, did you have any thoughts about the actual Battle of Britain and what happened in 1940 between June and September? I
would just say it's a matter of you have a lot of propaganda about this battle from our point of view, where it's all about like the happy few and like the happy few who braved against it's generally put down as like we were a massive underdog, whereas it was a position where, in terms of I don't know, geographically, yeah, you can suppose in some ways, but in other ways we weren't. Like there was no prospect really of us losing the Battle of Britain in the air war. It's kind of one of the things where it makes for a good narrative, I suppose, if you're like a boomer patriot type. But it's one of the things where you go, it becomes a lot less exceptionalist the more you look into the logistical and geographical burdens that Luftwaffe would have to deal with, even if it were to be a lot more successful dealing with the RAF.
Yeah, and bear in mind the Luftwaffe was not a strategic air force. It was designed really for support of the army, for the most part, and it was operating really at the extremes of its range. And the Brits had radar. We had the best radar in the world at that time, which was a big force multiplier. It meant that you didn't have to keep aircraft airborne all the time on patrol. You could send up aircraft as German raids developed over France because you could see them on the radar. And as I said, if things had gone more badly for the RAF, the fighter command could simply have withdrawn north of London, and had they done that, the Germans couldn't get to them because their fighters didn't have the range to do that. And without fighters, the German bombers would have been shot down in droves. Anything else to say on this AI before we move on to the myth of Sealion?
I mean, one of the I just sort of harking back to the sort of legacy that's come from it about the sort of plucky British underdog stuff and sort of how that's wrapped up in boomerism. I mean, it's also worth to note that one of the arguments that are used for the pro-mass migration side is all these different really over representing the number of Poles and Czechs that were in the the Air Force, for example, plays a sort of damaging role in that. I think also the plucky underdog that that Britain was on the edge and everything, and was going to be overrun by the Germans if the RAF lost. I think the first person to be really sort of beating that drum was the American ambassador to the United Kingdom, which was, of course, a Joseph P. Kennedy, JFK's father.
The
Um, uh,
very anti-British Joseph P. Kennedy.
yeah, he was.
He was very anti-British, partly because of his Irish ancestry.
Yeah, yeah. And he had his disagreements with Churchill, but I mean, ultimately, he was of this view that there was that this was going. I mean, he played into the idea of this. It was all over, and that Germany was going to invade Britain, and it was going to be like the same like France and Czechoslovakia. I mean, it's complete nonsense. I mean, I don't know how that man has any credibility even then, because I mean, like, dummy, the Navy for one, but I don't know. He seems to be like the first person to be um, uh, doing this. I will also say Churchill did play his role in this, because at this time, this is when you start him sort of appeasing Roosevelt to try and go cap in hand to get America into the war. So there was a lot of things happening at this time period to get people to do things. And but yeah, I mean, JFK Senior was incredibly anti-British, and started the spread of this lie.
Well, I don't know if you could say he started it. I think Churchill started it more than anybody else, with his never in the field of human conduct has so much been owned by so many to so few. Because there were 600 odd pilots. In fact, there were 700 odd pilots originally. But also that kind of negates the contribution of the Army and Navy anti-aircraft gunners and all the other people who were involved. But, there we
go. I mean, he did, like, he said that, Britain, what was it, like 6 months or something like that? It's just that I think that the JFK Senior, if he was like a if he was like my diplomat, I would sack him, because that for just gross incompetence.
He was telling Roosevelt that Britain wouldn't last long at all. Yes, I know that. Yeah.
And it's like, and it's kind of like self-evident, as we talk about with the Navy. I mean, with the Royal Navy, for example, even if the Air Force had like such a massive cock up, like on biblical proportion, that it couldn't function to defend Britain, even then, you couldn't be done because of the Royal Navy. An invasion couldn't happen because of the Royal Navy. So
we're going to come on to that next, AI, for sure.
I'd just like to add one thing. The reason why Kennedy was ambassador to Britain was in part due to the fact that JFK didn't want him to stand in the 1940 presidential election to a primary and possibly become the Democratic nominee. And so Kennedy's sitting on his arse in London as much to keep him out of American politics as it is anything to do with Anglo-American diplomacy.
Yeah, fair enough. That's fair enough. I think before we move on to Sealion, we need to say that what the Germans did was gradually change over to night bombing, particularly of London, but they bombed many other places, infamously, including Coventry, etc. They bombed Manchester, they bombed Glasgow, they bombed all over the damn place. Because at night in 1940, night fighters were in their infancy, and there was no airborne radar yet. That didn't come in until 1941. Radar actually in aircraft, which you need for an effective night fire. And so there was not much effective defense against night bombing in 1940, except anti-aircraft fire, and that wasn't terribly accurate, and Britain didn't have enough anti-aircraft guns in any case. In 1940, we did later on. So yeah, the German Air Force basically switched over to night bombing London, which of course is known as the Blitz and what have you. And my father's place was bombed flat during the night blitz. Fortunately, his family were all in the air raid shelter and no one was killed. But yeah, so the German Air Force went on to that. Now, there was supposedly this plan, Sealion. Well, I mean, there was this plan, Sealion, but it was a bit of a fantasy for the most part. If you look on the map, that map is actually a plan of what the German army wanted to do with a wide front invasion. But even this plan on the screen at the moment is a complete German army fantasy. And the German Navy, such as it was, very quickly pointed out to the German army that there's no possible way on God's earth that they could defend that sort of a crossing. It was far too big, far too wide.
Yeah, how would, first of all, you'd have to look, because you probably would have to use something like Fallschirmjäger, like the German paratroopers, and then land troops. But the problem is, let's say you had like a day's worth of break where you could trust the Royal Navy not to intercept your ships. Even so, like, you have a small window of time before the logistical supply routes for your landing forces are cut off, and they'd have to depend entirely upon that plundering off the British population. But I don't. But you wouldn't want to be a paratrooper dealing with a hostile population.
No, and also loads and loads of troops. Like, Britain wasn't short of troops in 1940. There were lots, because most of the BEF was got back. What it was short of was heavy weapons, because most of the BEF's tanks and guns and anti-tank guns, etc., and trucks were left behind in France.
Yeah, and the thing was, you don't, and of course, paratroopers and like Marines, they don't really have heavy weapons or tanks or anything, so you don't need heavy weapons to take care of them. As was proved at Crete, where you have, apparently there were like anecdotal parts where you'd have, like, let's say, a priest and a small Cretan child would like borrow like a shotgun from a museum in Crete and just use it to shoot paratroopers landing down during the Battle of Crete. So, or you'd have like little Greek grandmothers just going and stabbing like Fallschirmjäger as they go to land. And it's just like that's kind of what the Germans would be dealing with in terms of paratroopers alone. There'd just be something, just a heavy rate of attrition on day one, because you also got a factor. For example, you had stuff like we had to remove road signs, we had to paint over all manner of stuff at the Germans. Even if it were to land paratroopers, they couldn't tell the arse from their elbow, because they won't be able to know which place was where.
They also put obstacles in many of the fields that were reasonably close to the coast, so that you couldn't land gliders in them and all sorts of things. I think it's worth looking at obviously, if the Germans did try and carry out Sealion, it is worth looking at the difference between the German Navy and the Royal Navy. The German Navy in mid-1940 had between 2 and 3 battleships, 6 or 7 cruisers, and at most about 15 operational destroyers. This is after all the losses in Norway, etc. So, as I say, German Navy, 2 or 3 battleships, 6 or 7 cruisers, and about 15 destroyers. The Royal Navy at the same time had 15 or 16 battleships, 7 aircraft carriers, about 70 cruisers, and over 200 destroyers, etc. And they were building new cruisers and destroyers monthly, although Churchill would soon put a stop to that in his infinite wisdom. But obviously, some of the Royal Navy was overseas, but at least half of it, and something over half of it actually, was in home waters in 1940. So also the Germans had no landing craft. If you watch documentary films about D-Day with the Americans and Canadians and Brits landing in Normandy, you will see that they all had these specialist landing craft with bow doors and all the rest of it. Germans didn't have anything like that in 1940. Their plan, such as it was to use Rhine barges with a cutout ramp on the front. And many of these Rhine barges weren't even powered. They would have to be towed by tugs and fishing boats and stuff like that, which would mean they would be extremely slow. And I've listened to Royal Navy accounts that would suggest that a destroyer going past some of these Rhine barges, which bear in mind they're not designed for the open sea, a destroyer going past some of these Rhine barges at full pelt, which is like 35 knots, would actually probably swamp them with the wake, never mind using guns on them. Yeah, maybe the Germans could have got some troops ashore, but then how does the German Navy keep open the supply corridor to bring in more ammunition, to bring in tanks, to bring in guns and anti-tank guns?
I mean,
food. Hang on a minute, AI. Food
Yeah.
for the soldiers, and also withdrawing the wounded. How does the German Navy do that in the face of a Royal Navy which is like 4 times bigger at least in Britain, around Britain, I should say? It would have been impossible. The idea that Germany could seriously have invaded Britain is ludicrous. They had one airborne division because at that time the German airborne division hadn't been almost destroyed, taking Crete. And it took Crete against a far smaller and less well-equipped British force than would have been defending the south coast of England in 1940. And it was still almost destroyed by its casualties. In fact, the Germans never used it again as an airborne division. Like, they never dropped it by parachute as a division again, because they took so many casualties. And that's even if the Ju-52 German transports, which were very slow, wouldn't have been shot to shit by the RAF, which they would have been. The plan was ridiculous. It could never have worked, and it would have resulted in a German disaster, basically. It would have been like the Brits would have loved them to try it, but it would have been a disaster, and Hitler was never committed to it, really.
I mean, just sort of stating the obvious as well, if you look at the map of like the initial invasion sort of point, particularly, Kent and Sussex, a large part of that coastline is cliff. It's just straight up cliffs. Of course,
shingle beaches and cliffs, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, particularly like the around Dover, the White Cliffs there.
And there were also lots of pillboxes and machine gun posts and what have you that the Brits had put up in concrete. I'm going to pass it over. I'm going to leave this to Aaron because he mentioned it earlier. But there were also British plans to do all sorts of nastiness, like setting the sea on fire and also using poison gas, by the way.
Yeah, just to do the counterfactual, if you look at that map, you can just imagine the Royal Navy and the RAF sort of hemming the Germans in from sort of Ramsgate to maybe Folkestone. Probably further south the Germans could have landed was Bexhill. And let's say they get 1, maybe 2 waves of troops on the shore. After that, the Royal Navy and the RAF are going to cut them to ribbons. And when they're landing, you're going to have the RAF attacking them from the air. The British Army is going to be in various positions along that coast fighting them. And they're going to have, as Duke had mentioned, the sea being set on fire. And also, Churchill had authorised the use, if the Germans did make an invasion attempt, of poison gas. And so there would be gas being sent in against the German troops. The Germans would have been at sea, cut to ribbons, and wiped out on land. I think you could have seen sort of, let's say, 80-90% casualty rates for the German troops on land if they had actually landed. It would have been
totally think you're right, Aaron. I think it's also worth pointing out that in 1940, the German Luftwaffe was actually not very good at sinking ships at sea. It didn't have many torpedo aircraft, for example, and the ones it did have were all more or less confined to the Baltic because they were float planes, which were extremely vulnerable. So the German Air Force would not have been able to sink the Royal Navy. And also, of course, the Royal Navy would have been mainly operating at night, which they were very good at. The Royal Navy, in between the wars, spent most of its time training to fight at night, and they were good at it. Even if the Germans had managed to get troops ashore, they would not have been able to resupply them and reinforce them. Not a chance. No chance whatsoever. And the German Navy would have been fairly quickly sunk trying to defend them because it just didn't have the warships it needed to defend them. There was one German plan, which was to put one of their old pre-dreadnought battleships, which went back to about 1900. They had two of those still in World War II, which they'd been allowed to keep by the Treaty of Versailles. One German plan was to run two of them aground and use them as floating batteries, which I'm quite sure modern British battleships with 15-inch guns would have enjoyed the target practice of that. That would have been quite fun, I dare say. Not for the Germans, though.
I mean, not being funny. Imagine presenting that to Hitler and the generals, because that. I mean, I'm surely that the old Prussian military, the military corps would have looked at that and just think you were just an absolute retard for suggesting that these policies, these sort of proposals.
Also, you have to bear in mind that the German army, which had no experience at all of amphibious operations, were basically looking at it as a large-scale river crossing. And the English Channel is not a river, and it's a lot rougher. Particularly as the Germans weren't going to be ready to do this until at least September, by which time you sometimes get gales in the Channel.
It's funny you mention this, Andrew, because of course we did a stream some time ago where we talked about William of Normandy and his invasion of Britain, and also with under Claudius, the Roman invasion of Britain. There's this similarity of the problems of where to land. Now, with the Romans, they went up the Thames estuary, and of course William landed further west. But because of the geography and the weather, as you said, it actually. I mean, and also with William, you had Harold's the Saxon, some form of Saxon navy, which also caused a problem. So this is like a perennial problem with any attempts to invade
Britain. Caesar, I look at Julius Caesar. He invaded Britain twice, briefly, and on both occasions, half his warships were wrecked by the weather.
Yeah, and they all got shit scared because they saw chariots, and that freaked out a lot of the Romans.
The point I'm making is that the weather in the Channel is a very serious factor. And as I said, these Rhine River barges that the Germans plan to use, and by the way, RAF Bomber Command was bombing these every night in their Channel ports. The RAF Bomber Command wasn't not doing anything during the Battle of Britain. They were bombing these collections of barges in the Channel ports on the French side. But these Rhine River barges, many of them, as I said, unpowered, that would have to be towed, would have been amazingly vulnerable, not only to the warships of the Royal Navy, and the Royal Navy was not short of warships in 1940, but also to the weather. And as I said, the Luftwaffe, even if it had managed to force the RAF back from the coast, which of course it never did manage, but if it had, the Luftwaffe still wouldn't have been very efficient at sinking Royal Navy warships that were able to maneuver at full speed and had quite a lot of anti-aircraft guns. And on top of that, of course, they couldn't do anything at night against warships, nothing at all.
I mean, the only place I would think that the Germans would have had some sort of localized success or may have had a better time would be the landing at Lyme Regis and up that way.
Yeah, but that was abandoned very early on. AI, as I said when I was talking about the map, the German Navy very quickly said to the German Army, "That's ridiculous. We can't escort you out there at all. We just don't have enough ships." So the landing would, if they'd have ever actually tried it, it would have been on a much more narrow front, as Aaron was saying a bit earlier.
Yeah, the trouble is the southeast is too many military positions. It's too fortified. The southeast really for
because they
any invasion.
They knew that's where the Germans were coming, and also the Germans would have been the Brits did reconstitute an armored division fairly quickly, and they would have been hit by an armored division apart from anything else, and this would have been a German force that had almost no armor with it when it landed. The Germans had, as far as the Germans had gone, and they'd worked out how to get a few of their quite light tanks to be able to wade ashore. And that was as far as they'd gone, but there wouldn't have been many of them, and they weren't very powerful.
Yeah, and actually about this entire operation, there was actually a war game in, I think, it's Sandhurst in, 1974. Where
I don't know. I thought it was the 80s, Aaron, but yeah, you might be right. It might have been the 70s, and I remember it was a disaster for the German side.
Yeah, and it was done, jointly by the Sandhurst and the Daily Telegraph, and they got quite a few. For the German side, they actually got German. They would have been colonels at the time, but they later, by the end of the war, become generals too.
Yeah, and then they got actual RAF and Navy guys as well as British Army blokes to do it. Yeah, I remember.
Yeah, and the operation went the way that we're saying. It just was a complete disaster for the Germans.
Yeah, and there's no way it wouldn't have been. The idea that Britain was seriously under threat of invasion in 1940 is basically Churchill made up myth, and that's all it is. It's a myth. And that's besides the point, of course, that Hitler didn't want to invade Britain. He had no interest in invading Britain. And in fact, he was putting out peace feelers in 1940.
Yeah, it's worth noting, the German shipbuilding program was quite half-hearted at best, because you have situations where, let's say, the Navy wanted to build up, let's say, a pocket battleship, when instead they were building cruise ships for that Strength Through Joy program. Or the SS Wilhelm Gustloff was built, as opposed to building a ship for the German Navy. So,
yep, absolutely true. And also, I think it's worth pointing out that the whole of World War II, from 1940 to 1945, in terms of surface ships, the Germans built a grand total of one more battleship, which was the Tirpitz, which eventually the RAF sank, and about 25 destroyers. That was the entire surface ship building of the Germans in World War II. And also in 1940, another thing that we didn't mention that we should, is the Germans didn't have that many U-boats in 1940. And also, U-boats would have not liked being in the English Channel because it's very narrow and it's also not all that deep. And it would have been a very unhealthy place for German U-boats. So they wouldn't have been able to redress the balance either. And as I said, the Germans didn't even have that many U-boats in 1940. So there was no way that the invasion could have worked. It was a complete fantasy.
I can't help but draw the comparison proposals with the Allied invasion of Japan, the proposal invasions of Japan, because similar sort of things, incredible heavy losses.
But there was a difference, though, AI, in that if the Allies had invaded Japan, it would have had enormous an enormous fleet supporting it of not only American but British warships. And they would have been using scores of divisions and with loads of specialist landing craft. And it would have been totally different, in other words, is what I'm trying to say. And yeah, the casualties were predicted to be very high, but it probably would have succeeded eventually, whereas the German invasion of Britain was a fantasy. And they had none of the equipment they needed to do it. It would have just been impossible. Look at the difficulties of the Normandy invasion in 1944, and also bear in mind by that stage, the Brits and Americans had already done the torch landings in North Africa. Like the Americans landed in one place and the Brits landed in another. We did the invasion of Sicily. Then we did several amphibious invasions in Italy. And then look at the massive naval forces and air forces that were supporting the invasion in Normandy, and all the specialist landing craft and specialist tanks and all the rest of it. The Germans had none of this stuff in 1940. It would have been a total disaster for them. And the idea, and it annoys me. It's part of the Churchill legend, which I think is much exaggerated. I'm not a big fan of Winston Churchill and never have been. It's part of the Churchill legend. All this, Britain's finest hour, and we were going to be invaded, and we stood alone. Leave aside the Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, and South Africans, etc., because we didn't stand alone. We had the whole empire with us, but and particularly the White Empire, which was the most important part of it.
At that point, at the start of the Second World War, technically the British Empire was at its largest in its history. I mean, it would stretching, including territories of Palestine and Iraq, and even the new and newly acquired bits, but
many of which were of dubious value in terms of fighting. But there were Australian soldiers sent to Britain in 1940. There were Canadian soldiers. There were New Zealand and South African pilots in the RAF, and also with their own squadrons supporting the British. It's the Rhodesians, etc. But the idea that Britain was under imminent threat of invasion in 1940 is just bullshit, frankly. And mostly it's bullshit because the Royal Navy was vastly more powerful than the German Navy. Vastly more powerful. Like the Italian Navy in the Mediterranean was 2.5 times the size of the Germans. Easily.
I will say, I mean, after I've watched countless documentaries on the Second World War and the various campaigns. I would say that the German army was really designed. I mean, with the exception of France westward, the German army was just totally tailored and designed to expand, to go eastward, and to go against forces in the east. More so, it was designed for the vastness of the European landmass, not so much the ocean to the west.
The AI absolutely. And to be honest with you, I think if the Brits and French hadn't given the guarantee to Poland and then declared war in 1939, I don't think Hitler was interested in going west at all. I really don't think he was. I definitely think he would have eventually invaded the Soviet Union. And yes, he wanted to invade Poland, but I don't think he had any great interest in invading France, to be honest with you.
No, I agree, Duke. I don't think he did. I think let's do the counterfactual. Let's say for whatever reason, the Chamberlain government doesn't give the Polish guarantee. The Poles, I don't think are going to back down, purely because they remember 1920 where they faced down the Soviets. So I think they can do it again.
They had an exaggerated They had an
Yeah.
exaggerated idea of their strength. That's very true, Aaron. Yes.
And so,
Actually, and also just because I know that there may be retrospectively from the stream, people say, well, okay, maybe he didn't want to take France, but how come he symbolically used the same rail car to signing of the Treaty of Versailles and everything? I would say, I mean, on that part, Hitler was a politician, and he understood that the national shame and the humiliation from the Treaty of Versailles, that was straight up political maneuvering for his own German audience. That was just a political move. It wasn't. It was presented to him, and he just took it.
Yeah, honestly, I mean, I'll ask Mitch and Aaron for their thoughts, and you, AI, in a sec. But my own thoughts are that if Britain hadn't guaranteed Poland and then declared war in September 1939, I don't think Hitler had much of an intention of invading France. I really don't.
Yeah,
I don't think that's what he was interested in. He was interested in land in the east.
Yeah, it's worth noting. So Hitler had an interview with Bertrand de Juvenel in early 1936, where he said that he will scrap all German claims to Alsace-Lorraine, provided that it guarantees a peace in the West. Like Hitler also did
Yes, yeah, no, I have seen that, Mitch. You're quite correct. Yes, he did.
Yeah, he also did what was Save Tyrol with Mussolini, because Save Tyrol had a German minority than Mussolini. That's why historically Mussolini was so fond of Anschluss. But so Hitler says he's going to recede on any German claims to Alsace-Lorraine in the interest of peace with France. So if we didn't guarantee Poland, and because the thing was, you had the Polish foreign minister Josef Beck, who was quite. There are many things to be said about him. Many people regard him as a snake. Now, after we guaranteed the Polish regarding Danzig, it was a matter of the Polish just thought, well, there's no point in negotiating. Because at that point, they had us guaranteeing them. So,
which was foolish of them, because there was no practical help we could actually give them. But yeah.
Yeah, because you got to factor that Poland, for example, unlike Czechoslovakia, is as flat as a pancake. You know, it's like the Netherlands fell in 5 days for good reason, because the land is flat as a pancake. It suits the panzer warfare that Germans had. And also, Poland is the other side of Europe from us. So, with the exception of like the Navy, who managed to get away, and some Polish guys like Sosabowski and others who helped us later on, Poland can't really do much except just get slaughtered by the Germans.
Yeah, and particularly with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which means the Soviets invade just after the Germans. So, you know. But yeah, to me, the sane thing for Britain and France to do in 1939 was to continue to build up their armed forces at a sensible rate that wasn't going to send them bankrupt. And await events, basically. And you've also got to say that, you know, if Britain, it was Britain giving the guarantee to Poland, which turns what, as Aaron was saying, what Hitler wanted and the Germans wanted, which was a local war against Poland, into a world war. If we don't do that, then World War III doesn't break out in September 1939.
Yeah,
because Britain and France can sit behind their defences and continue to build up their armed forces. So if Hitler changes his mind at some point, and I don't know why he would, to be honest, we're then in a much stronger position.
Yeah, it's also worth noting with Hitler, so he wanted a war with Czechoslovakia also because Hitler was Austrian, and the Austrian Germans, they had a long-standing dislike of the Czechs, whereas the Prussians in Germany, especially like the Prussian Junker aristocrat class, they hated the Poles, but Hitler, as an Austrian, didn't really have any hatred towards the Poles. So, for example, in 1935, when Josef Pilsudski died, Hitler attended a Catholic service in Berlin, commemorating Pilsudski's life, because you got to factor Pilsudski at that time, he was well respected as a savior of Europe. Like he was the one who achieved a miracle of a Vistula against the Soviet Union at the Battle of Warsaw in 1920. Now, the thing was, the Polish had no chance of a deal with Stalin, because Stalin still was very much embittered against the Polish, because part of the reason why the Polish won in 1920 was because Stalin messed about with some of the orders for his troops. So there was like a massive bulging gap between Tukhachevsky's men and the nearest other Soviet army in like much further south than it otherwise should have been. And Stalin really had a lot to blame. Stalin never got over this. So, you know, in another scenario, perhaps the Polish could have come to a deal with the Germans. But to be fair, again, like you can understand why the Polish are reluctant at best to do a deal with the Germans, because you got to factor, well, the Germans have their own territorial claims. Like even when you have guys like Gustav Stresemann in charge of Weimar Germany, even as liberal and democratic as they were, they said there would be no pact with the East, because the hatred of the Poles regarding, let's say, areas of Danzig and Silesia were just non-negotiable. So it was a matter of perhaps war was inevitable between Germany and Poland, but we should never get ourselves involved for what was otherwise a futile endeavour, because we knew the Germans were going to war with the Soviet Union at some point. And if it comes to that, well, Poland will be fought over. So we go to war with Germans for the sake of Poland, and the end result is Poland becomes a Soviet puppet state for over 40 years.
Yeah, and it's even worse than that, Mitch, because at one stage, because of the Soviet invasion of Finland, Britain and France were even considering going to war with the Soviets. So, you know, it was even more insane than it seems on the surface. As I said earlier, the Royal Navy were building up on the basis that the war would break out in 1942. And had it done so, the Royal Navy would have been a hell of a lot more modern and stronger than it was, in fact, in 1939. And then, of course, Churchill came in, and one of the first things he did as Prime Minister was to pause building on all capital ships, carriers, and cruisers that were not going to be finished within a couple of months. And this didn't really matter in 1940 in terms of Sealion or anything like that. But it had a terrible effect on the Royal Navy in late 1941 and 1942. It is, for example, the reason there was no aircraft carrier with Force Z in Singapore. Was Churchill stopping the building of all the larger warships, and it delayed all of them by at least 8 months, and it delayed some for 18 months or more. And in fact, it led to things like the Lion class battleships not being finished at all during the war, or even afterwards. They were scrapped before they were launched. But going to war in 1939 over Poland was insane. It was frankly insane. And Churchill was one of the guys who was mad keen to do it, of course. Well, Aaron, what's your thinking on this final topic?
I think if we hadn't given the Polish guarantee, the Germans would have seen a German-Polish war in late August, early September 1939. There probably would have been some kind of accommodation with the Soviets, because as soon as Molotov is appointed German foreign minister, he's talking about the idea. And I think eventually you probably would have seen a bit later than you did. So later on in 1939, probably an accommodation with the Soviets. More likely after the invasion of Poland. So you probably would still have had the Winter War, and then as soon as the war in Poland is finished, Hitler would have been getting things ready for an invasion of the Soviet Union. And it should be pointed out that the German generals were very, very wary about invading France in 1940 but they were absolutely ready and ready to go to invade the Soviet Union because many of them were veterans of the First World War, and they remembered 1918 as the year that they defeated the Russians, and they thought they can do it again. And there's a very famous Hitler quote of him describing the Soviet Union as a rotting edifice that you kick the doors in and the whole thing's going to collapse. And so you would have probably seen a German invasion of the Soviet Union. Most likely, I'm not quite sure it would have taken place in 1940, purely because the Germans would have wanted to get allies involved. The Germans, throughout 1940 itself, especially late 1948, 1941 in history, are getting various allies on side. That's what eventually causes the invasion of Yugoslavia in April 1941. The fact that they bully the Interpol into, who is the regent for Yugoslavia, into joining the Tripartite Pact, and then there's a coup against him to pull Yugoslavia out. So you probably would have seen 1940 be the year of planning for the invasion of the Soviet Union and getting all the allies lined up, and then 1941, almost certainly when it did take place, in reality, the invasion of the Soviet Union. I've got to say, I think Britain, I should say, may have been drawn into the war, but purely because of what was going on in the Balkans, and it would have been the Italians that caused it over Greece, because Greece being a traditional British sphere of influence in the Balkans, and the Italians deciding to have a war there, which I think they probably would have done, given that that if you look what happens with Albania, the reason why Mussolini goes into Albania is because Hitler has gone into Czechoslovakia and not told him. And so I can quite imagine going into Poland, not telling Mussolini, and Mussolini deciding, right, we're going to go have a go at Greece.
On the other hand, Aaron, against that, and you might be right about this, I'm not sure, but I would just point out that Mussolini came into the war quite late, when France was basically already beaten. And I don't think that Mussolini was very keen on the idea of trying to fight Britain and France in the Mediterranean. I don't think that would have suited him at all. And don't forget, Britain sank or disabled most of the larger and more powerful French warships, because Churchill ordered the Royal Navy to go and destroy any French ships which wouldn't surrender. And I think that Mussolini, whose navy wasn't really able to cope with the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean, knew that he wouldn't be able to cope with the Royal Navy and the French Navy in the Mediterranean. And I think he would have been much more careful about what he was going to do if Britain and France were not actually at war and were still fully in control of their colonies and what have you around that part of the world.
I don't think so. I think that if you just look at the reason I say this is purely because if you look at his reaction to the Germans sending the tanks into Prague in March 1939, it's to launch a full-scale invasion of Albania in April 1939.
Yeah, I know he did that, Aaron, but there's another thing to look at. The Germans did not want to actually send forces into the Balkans. That was not in Hitler's plans. He did it, he had to do it, because there was a revolution in Yugoslavia, backed by the British, by the way, and Mussolini had got into trouble in Greece, but he didn't want to do it, and it actually delayed his invasion of the Soviet Union, and possibly quite big effect on it.
No, there was no. That's a myth, Duke. Yugoslavia.
It didn't delay it as long as people say it did, but it certainly did delay it by about 3 or 4 weeks. It did. People claim it delayed it by a much longer period, which it didn't, because you can't invade the Soviet Union during the Rasputinia, I think it's called, when everything is mud. So it didn't delay it by long, but it did delay it for a few weeks. And that actually might have made a difference right at the end of 1941 when the Germans were pretty close to Moscow.
Yeah,
that couple of weeks might have made a difference.
Yeah.
But the Germans weren't keen on occupying the Balkans. They didn't want to. And you've also got to look at when Britain sent forces to Greece, we were already fighting Britain. Britain was already fighting Italy and Germany. I think if it had just been the Italians invading Greece, I don't see Britain declaring war over that. To be honest with you, I don't.
No, I can see that that leading to a war.
I mean, I could see that it could, but I don't think it necessarily would have. And also, given that if you declare war on Italy, you're basically declaring war on Germany as well because of the Axis Pact. Because Hitler's going to declare war on you if you declare war on Mussolini. A sensible British government wouldn't have done it because does Britain really care who runs Greece? Not that much.
Well, I would. Well, Duke, you're saying a sensible British government, but if we're doing this counterfactual, the British government in question would still be the Chamberlain government.
Yes.
Who gave the post guarantee. So the idea that these are quote unquote a sensible British governments.
Well, I see what you're saying. Yeah. When did Chamberlain was pretty sick, wasn't he, when he resigned?
Yes, he resigned in October 40 and he dies November.
So it's probably not going to be a Chamberlain government, but equally it's probably not going to be a Churchill government.
No. Because
Churchill only came to power because of Norway, which was half his bloody fault anyway. But I don't think you would have. And Churchill was very unpopular with most conservatives because of his crossing of the floor so often, and the fact that he really wasn't a conservative, to be honest. You might have got a Halifax government then. Who knows? Maybe.
Well, actually, I think you may well have, given him being young enough and the fact that him actually being reasonably popular within the Conservative Party, for all of the fact that he'd fallen out with Chamberlain, you may well have even seen an Eden government.
Yeah, and that might have been a bit dubious because Eden was a bit dubious. But I'm not a big Eden fan, I've got to say. And also, Eden was very anti-Italian for reasons best known to himself. I never worked out why, to be honest, but he was. But yeah, maybe. I mean, it's open to question. But even so, even if Britain gets dragged into the war in 1941, a lot better than going to war in 1939. Royal Navy's a lot stronger, RAF's a lot stronger, Army's a lot stronger. Yeah. And you've still got the French as a useful ally.
Yeah. And you may well have seen Belgium being sort of brought back into the fold in terms of Anglo-French strategy.
Yeah. And also, I mean, by 1941, Hitler is absolutely committed to invading the Soviet Union. So he's certainly not invading France in 1941. Not going to happen. No. So it would have been a very interesting counterfactual. But AI, Mitch, any comments on this stuff before we close?
I would say on the matter of Greece, I mean, I would say, like, having a strategic concern in the Southern Balkans at least is kind of warranted because you got a factor, right? Let's say your British government, right? You're keeping tabs on Adolf Hitler, even when he's in, let's say, in another world where we didn't bother getting involved with Poland, but we see him expanding eastward. Of course, you're going to keep tabs on someone like Hitler, and you're going to look upon Greece as a possible launch base for bombers to bomb the oil fields in Romania. So it's kind of like, even if, like, because on one hand, there's also a lot of Greek. I mean, I can imagine there's a lot of Grecophilia among learned Englishmen of that time as well. Because, I mean, for example, I remember reading about how when there were British soldiers serving in Greece during when the communists there were kicking off, there were cases where British soldiers would just spend their free time just like going through the ruins and they could read the original ancient Greek because they learned it
Yep.
at school.
Yep, that's true. Yep, it was very much so for British officers, etc. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I mean, like I said, I don't have a decided opinion on whether Britain would have gone to war over Greece if we hadn't been at war with anyone already. But it's possible, certainly. But even if that had happened, Britain would still have been infinitely better off than going to war in 1939. But whatever. Like the RAF would have been twice as strong. The Royal Navy would have been probably a quarter stronger than it was. And the army would have been much bigger and better equipped. And of course, you haven't lost all your equipment at Dunkirk, which would have been kind of good. So there's that. But yeah, I just think the Polish guarantee was one of the most ridiculous things Britain's done. It wasn't quite as bad as going to war in 1914 and then raising a mass army against all British military tradition, but it was close. AI. Well, any final thoughts on this stuff? Can't hear you, AI, if you're around. Maybe you're muted.
That's it. Says he's not on mute for me.
No, he doesn't. He doesn't seem to be muted. Maybe he's not at his keyboard or something. AI, are you with us? Maybe he's having problems with the internet. If AI comes back, I'll ask him in a minute. Aaron, would you like to plug anything you're doing?
Yes, actually, this is something me and you, Duke, are going to do. At the weekend, I finished HMS Surprise by Patrick O'Brien, which is the third in the Aubrey Maturin books. And so at some point, probably next week, myself and Duke are going to do a live stream discussing HMS Surprise.
Looking forward to that one, Aaron, because Patrick O'Brien is such a brilliant author. Definitely one of my favorite authors. Yeah, looking forward to that. And your channel, Aaron, is?
Oh, it's Aaron James Hook.
There you go. So check out Aaron's channel. Mitch, anything you want to plug, mate?
No, not for me.
Okay. Well, you can find Mitch on X, by the way. Why are you at Anglo Gropnik, I believe?
Yeah, at Anglo _Gopnik. All I've done is basically I saw a congressman on Twitter posting a bit of that, that famous clip by Leonardo DiCaprio about Rhodesia versus Zimbabwe. So I just put in like a little Rhodesia edit on there. So if people want to look up a little Rhodesia edit, they can look up my Twitter, I suppose.
Cool. Woodpit 420 is saying any ETA for Rorke's Drift stream, Duke. I've done 2 Rorke's Drift streams with Aaron now. Is that all right, Aaron?
Yes, we did one on the film Zulu, and then we did one on the battle itself.
Yeah. So if you they've already been done, Woodpit. If you want to go and check on Aaron James Hook on his YouTube channel, you can find both of them there, I believe.
Yep. They're done both in March, so you don't have to go too far into my live streams to find them.
Good. AI, are you? Oh, sorry, damn it. AI, are you there? AI. Okay, AI is not around, so I will just tell you that his channel is it's AI Shire Homelander, I believe. I think it's AI Shire Homelander. Is that right, guys? So yeah, go and check out AI's YouTube channel, AI Shire Homelander. It's worth checking out. He's got some good content on there. Okay. Thank you very much to my guests this evening, Aaron Hook, AI, and Mitch. And I am going to try and play us out with a tune. Let's see if I can. If this doesn't work, by the way, I'm going to try something else for Saturday. See how long this takes. Bum, 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 bum. Okay. Let's see if it works.
I'm sure it'll come back.
Yeah.
I won't be surprised if next week we end up doing Rhodesia. I went to a said congressman earlier.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to give up on that. I'm paying, I don't know, nearly $50 a month to use StreamYards, and I can't play a bloody stream, a music stream with just a fixed picture on it. I will try something else for Saturday's stream. All right, guys, let me just check if we got any entropy stuff. I don't think we did, but I will have a look. Yeah, there we go. Don't think so.
Tell you what, you've seen as a Rhodesia post is back on the menu tonight on Twitter. We might as well do Rhodesia next week, the way we're giving.
We could do Rhodesia, yeah. I'd be quite happy to do Rhodesia, Mitch.
Yeah.
I was thinking of doing a stream on the Shangani patrol at some stage, but we could also do a longer Rhodesia stream that looked at the more modern history of the place and how Britain and the rest of the West, including South Africa, eventually betrayed the damn place. But anyway, we could do that. Anyway, thank you very much to my guests, Aaron Hook and AI, who we seem to have lost. He said his internet wasn't very good this evening. And also Mitch. So we'll see you on Saturday for our normal politics and current affairs stream. And in the meantime, don't let the bastards grind you down.